The rain poured mercilessly on the dark streets of Los Angeles, soaking everything in sight. At a lonely gas station, a tired, pregnant woman worked through the night while her little daughter sat quietly, drawing pictures of a life they could only dream of. What she didn't know was that a stranger, one she had no reason to recognize, was about to change their lives forever. Sometimes the kindest souls hide behind the most unexpected faces. What if a simple act of generosity could rewrite someone's entire future? This is the story of a struggling mother, an 8-year-old girl, and an unassuming man who refused to turn a blind eye to their suffering. And in doing so, he gave them a second chance at life. Emily never planned for her life to turn out this way. There was a time, not so long ago, when she had dreams, big ones. She had envisioned herself in a crisp white chef's coat, standing behind a bustling kitchen counter, creating dishes that told stories. She had dreamed of opening a small, cozy restaurant where families could gather, sharing laughter over warm meals made with love. She had pictured a space filled with the rich aroma of freshly baked bread and simmering sauces, the comforting clatter of plates, and the soft murmur of people savoring every bite. But dreams don't pay rent. And when reality hit, it hit hard. Emily's life had become a relentless cycle of exhaustion. The days blurred into each other, each one more grueling than the last. She would wake before the sun rose, her body protesting with aches she had long since stopped acknowledging. There was no time to rest, no time to think. Her first job started at 6 in the morning, working in the back of a diner where the scent of bacon and burnt coffee clung to her clothes. She scrubbed grease from pans, refilled ketchup bottles, and bussed tables where people left behind half-eaten meals she sometimes wished she could take home. By the time her shift ended, she barely had time to catch a bus to her second job, stacking shelves at a grocery store, scanning barcodes, and offering tired smiles to customers who barely noticed her. At night, she came home to a tiny, damp apartment where the walls were too thin and the neighbors argued in muffled voices. The air smelled like old fabric and cheap air freshener, a feeble attempt to mask the scent of mildew creeping in from the corners. The landlord had already warned her. One more late payment, and she and her daughter, Sophia, would be out on the streets, a child who understood too much. Sophia was only 8, but she carried the weight of the world in her small hands. She never complained when Emily asked her to eat slowly, stretching out meals that were too small to begin with. She never questioned why the lights flickered when the bill wasn't paid on time. She never asked for new clothes, even when her shoes grew too tight, or why their dinners consisted mostly of plain rice or toast. But she noticed everything. She noticed how Emily would pretend to be full, pushing her plate away even though her stomach growled at night. She noticed how her mother's hands trembled when opening the electricity bill, her fingers gripping the paper too tightly. She noticed how Emily's shoulders slumped just a little lower each night when she thought no one was looking. And yet, Emily never let her daughter see her cry. Instead, she tucked Sophia into bed with a smile, brushing stray strands of hair from her face and whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. "It's going to be okay," she would say. "We just have to be strong." But even the strongest people have their limits. The night that changed everything, that night, rain pounded against the roof of the gas station where Emily worked her third shift. The fluorescent lights above flickered erratically, casting a sickly yellow glow over the near-empty store. Outside, the streets were nearly deserted, save for the occasional car speeding past, splashing through deep puddles. Emily wiped down the counter with slow, tired motions, her body screaming for rest. The exhaustion was a constant, clawing at her bones, threatening to pull her under. In the corner, Sophia sat cross-legged on the cold tile floor, completely absorbed in her drawings. Her fingers moved carefully, sketching the outline of a warm house with glowing windows. A house they had never known. Emily stole a glance at the clock. 3 more hours to go. She exhaled deeply, rolling her stiff shoulders, when the bell above the door chimed, signaling a customer. She barely looked up. She had stopped expecting kindness from strangers a long time ago. But this one was different. A man in a worn leather jacket stepped inside, shaking off the rain. Droplets clung to his dark hair, his boots leaving faint, wet prints on the linoleum floor. He moved with an easy confidence, heading toward the coffee machine, as if he had done it 1,000 times before. As he poured himself a cup, he glanced toward the counter, then at the little girl on the floor. His eyes lingered for a moment. Emily noticed but didn't react. She was used to the stares. People often looked at them with either pity or silent judgment, but no one ever did anything. The man approached the counter, setting his coffee down. His voice, when he spoke, was calm and steady. "Long shift?" Emily forced a small smile. "Always." He looked back at Sophia, watching as the little girl carefully shaded the edges of a tiny house in her drawing. "She's talented," he observed. Emily followed his gaze, her lips curving into something almost like pride. "She loves to draw, says she wants to be an artist one day." The man took a sip of his coffee, considering her words. Then after a moment he asked, "And you, what do you want?" Emily hesitated. No one had asked her that in years. What did she want? She wanted a home, a real one where Sophia didn't have to sleep with her coat on during winter nights. She wanted a life where exhaustion wasn't her constant companion, where she didn't have to choose between paying rent and buying groceries. She wanted to cook again, to create, to build something that belonged to her. But that was just a dream. So instead, she gave the only answer she could. "I just want to keep a roof over our heads," she admitted, her voice quieter than before. The man nodded as if he understood something unspoken. He finished his coffee, reached into his pocket, and placed a few bills on the counter. Then before Emily could say anything more, he turned and walked out into the rain. Emily watched him go, then exhaled, shaking off the brief interaction. Strangers came and went. That was life. What she didn't know was that this particular stranger would come back, and when he did, everything would change. The next morning, Emily awoke to the relentless buzzing of her alarm. The sound drilled into her skull, making her head throb. She reached for the cheap plastic clock beside her mattress, pressing the worn-out snooze button with a groan. Every muscle in her body ached, as if she had spent the night carrying the weight of the world on her back. She blinked at the cracked ceiling above her, trying to summon the energy to move. Her entire being screamed for just 5 more minutes of sleep. 5 minutes without responsibility, without stress, without fear gnawing at the edges of her thoughts. But she didn't have that luxury. Beside her, on the same small mattress they shared, Sophia was curled up under their thin blankets. The little girl's breathing was slow and peaceful, her tiny hands tucked under her cheek. In sleep, she looked weightless, unburdened by the hardships of their reality. Emily envied that. Carefully, she sat up, trying not to disturb her daughter. The air in the apartment was stale, tinged with the faint scent of dampness and old fabric. She rubbed her eyes, letting out a deep sigh before swinging her legs over the side of the mattress. Another day, another endless battle against exhaustion. The world didn't stop for single mothers, and kindness, that was a currency she couldn't afford to rely on. Then came the knock. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. No one ever knocked on their door. The only sounds she was used to were the distant arguments of neighbors through the paper-thin walls, the occasional sirens wailing outside, or the rustling of bills slipping under her door, reminders of payments she struggled to make. But a knock? That was foreign. Heart pounding, she hesitantly stood and walked toward the door, her bare feet making no sound against the worn-out floor. She paused, pressing her ear against the wood, listening. No voices, no movement. Cautiously, she unlatched the lock and cracked the door open. Her breath hitched. Standing on the other side was the same man from the gas station. Only this time he wasn't just passing through. Bryan stood there, rainwater still clinging to his leather jacket. But what caught Emily's attention wasn't him. It was the grocery bags in his hands. Several large, heavy bags filled to the brim with fresh fruits, vegetables, and loaves of warm bread. She caught glimpses of pasta, canned goods, and things she hadn't been able to afford in months. And on top of it all, resting neatly among the groceries, was a box of brand new colored pencils. Emily gripped the doorframe tighter, her throat tightening. "I figured you could use a little help," Bryan said, offering a small, almost sheepish smile. Emily's first instinct was suspicion. Life had conditioned her to be wary of kindness, because kindness often came with strings attached. A favor always meant a debt. A handout always meant an expectation. Her lips parted, but the only word that escaped was, "Why?" Bryan shrugged, shifting the weight of the bags in his arms. "Because I can." For a long moment, she just stood there, staring at the moms, then at him. Her pride screamed at her to say no. But her reality, the empty fridge, the overdue bills, the gnawing hunger that had become a permanent state, whispered louder. Then from behind her, a small voice broke the silence. "Are those for me?" Sophia had woken up and was now peeking from behind her mother. Her sleepy eyes locked onto the colored pencils on top of the groceries. Her fingers clutched the hem of Emily's shirt, hesitant but hopeful. Bryan nodded. "They are." Emily swallowed hard. Still hesitant, but too desperate to refuse, she finally reached out and accepted the groceries. Her fingers brushed against the cold plastic handles, and for the first time in a long while, she felt something foreign. "Relief, thank you," she said quietly. the words feeling both foreign and fragile on her tongue. Bryan nodded once before stepping back. "Take care," he said simply. And then, just like that, he turned and walked away. Emily stood in the doorway, watching him disappear down the street, the weight of the grocery bags pressing into her arms. It wasn't until she unpacked them that she realized something unusual. These weren't just random items thrown together. The groceries were thoughtful, her favorite brand of coffee, the exact kind of cereal Sophia loved, even fresh herbs, something she had always wished she could afford for cooking. She stared at the assortment, her mind spinning. Who was this man? Over the next few weeks, Bryan returned to the gas station every now and then. He never made a big deal of it. Sometimes he would just buy a cup of coffee and chat for a few minutes before leaving. Other times, he left behind small surprises, a warm meal, an extra tip, a new sketchbook for Sophia. At first, Emily was hesitant to trust it. She had spent so long expecting disappointment that kindness felt unnatural. But Bryan never asked for anything in return. People weren't like this. At least, not in her experience. Life had taught her that survival meant depending only on herself. But Bryan was different. Then one evening, he dropped a bombshell on her. A path she never thought possible. "I signed you up for a culinary course," he said casually, handing her a neatly folded piece of paper. Emily's hands trembled as she took it. "You what?" "I remember you said you used to love cooking," Bryan said with a shrug. "Thought you might want to give it another shot." She unfolded the paper, scanning the details. It wasn't just some casual cooking class. It was a professional culinary program designed to train chefs. A real opportunity. A reality slammed into her like a freight train. "I can't," she said immediately, shaking her head. "I don't have time. I have work and—" "I already spoke to your boss," Bryan interrupted smoothly. "He agreed to let you adjust your shifts." Emily's breath hitched. She was speechless. Bryan leaned against the counter, his expression calm but firm. "Look, I get it. You've spent so long fighting just to survive that you've forgotten what it's like to dream. But this is your shot, a way out. Take it." Emily felt as though the world had suddenly tilted beneath her feet. For years, she had buried every hope, every ambition, because she didn't have the luxury of chasing dreams. But now someone was handing her one on a silver platter. Sophia tugged at her sleeve, her eyes wide and full of unfiltered hope. "You should do it, Mama." Emily's chest tightened. Fear clawed at her. What if she failed? What if this was all some cruel joke? But then she saw the belief in Bryan's eyes, the silent message that told her, "You can do this." So with a shaky breath, she nodded. Okay. The first few weeks were harder than anything she had ever done. Balancing work, motherhood, and culinary classes was overwhelming. But for the first time in forever, Emily felt alive. She rediscovered the joy of cooking, the thrill of creating something from scratch. The passion she had buried under years of struggle came rushing back. Every night she came home exhausted but fulfilled. Sophia would sit at the table, eager to hear about the dishes she had learned. Emily would practice late into the night, perfecting her skills, allowing herself to believe in a future she had once thought impossible. And Bryan? He never once interfered. He never hovered, never made her feel like she owed him anything. He simply watched from a distance, ready to catch her if she needed it, but never forcing her to lean on him. Then one day he asked her to meet him in a quiet part of town. What Emily didn't know was that her life was about to change forever. The morning started like any other, until the phone rang. Emily was rinsing the last of the breakfast dishes, her hands numb from the cold water. The tiny kitchen smelled of buttered toast and instant coffee, the usual remnants of a meal carefully stretched to last. Sophia sat at the wobbly wooden table, her head bent over her latest drawing. A bright splash of color filled the page, an image of a house with an open door and smoke curling from the chimney. A home. Emily's phone vibrated on the counter, the sound breaking the quiet routine of their morning. She wiped her hands on a dish towel before picking it up. "Hello?" Bryan's voice came through the line, calm as always. But today, there was something different about it. A quiet excitement, a restrained energy like he was holding on to a secret. "Can you meet me somewhere?" he asked. Emily frowned, glancing at Sophia, who was humming softly to herself as she colored. "Now, May," Bryan chuckled. "Yes, now, trust me." Emily sighed, shaking her head with a half smile. If there was one thing she had learned over the past few months, it was that when Bryan Cranston had a plan, it was best to just go along with it. She turned to Sophia. "Sweetheart, I need to go out for a little bit. Stay inside, okay? I won't be long." Sophia looked up with curious eyes. "Where are you going?" Emily hesitated. "I don't know yet." The little girl giggled, twirling a strand of hair around her finger. That sounds like an adventure. Emily smiled, brushing a kiss against Sophia's forehead before grabbing her coat. She had no idea that she was about to walk into the biggest adventure of her life. Following Bryan's instructions, Emily took a bus across town to a neighborhood she had never been to before. As she stepped off at the stop he had mentioned, her breath hitched. This wasn't just any street. The sidewalks were lined with quaint little shops, their windows decorated with string lights and charming hand-painted signs. Couples strolled hand in hand, stopping to admire fresh pastries displayed behind glass. A man sat at a cafe table, sipping his coffee as he read a newspaper, looking as if he had nowhere to be but here. Emily felt out of place. This was not a part of the city she belonged to. This was a world where people had time to breathe, where life wasn't just about surviving. She spotted Bryan standing a few steps ahead, his hands tucked into the pockets of his leather jacket, a small, knowing smile on his face. Emily walked up to him, her stomach twisting with uncertainty. "What is this?" Instead of answering, Bryan gestured toward the storefront beside him. It was small but beautiful. The windows were spotless, reflecting the bright morning sun, and the door was freshly painted in a deep shade of blue. A warm glow came from the inside, though the space appeared empty. Bryan nodded toward the door. "Go inside." Emily hesitated, her pulse quickening. "Bryan," he just smiled. "Trust me." She swallowed hard and stepped forward, reaching for the brass handle. The door creaked open. The moment she stepped inside, Emily was overwhelmed. The air smelled of fresh paint and polished wood. The space was small but perfect, cozy, intimate, exactly the kind of place she had once dreamed of having. Stainless steel countertops gleamed under the sunlight, filtering through the windows. The walls were bare but inviting, ready to be filled with stories, with laughter, with life. A row of shelves stood empty, waiting to be stocked with ingredients, spices, and memories yet to be made. Her fingers brushed against the smooth surface of a brand new cooking station. Everything was pristine. Everything was waiting for her. She turned back to Bryan, her chest tightening. "I don't understand." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small envelope, handing it to her. Emily took it with trembling hands. She could feel the thickness of the paper inside, the weight of something important. She slowly opened it, unfolding the crisp document. Her eyes scanned the words, her breath catching as she read the name printed at the top. Lokia Deona, owner, Emily Carter. Her hands shook. Her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. She looked up at Bryan, her vision blurring. "Bryan, what is this?" Bryan stuffed his hands back into his pockets, his expression easy, as if what he was saying was the simplest thing in the world. "Your restaurant." Emily's legs felt weak, her entire body going cold and hot all at once. No, I can't." "Yes, you can," Bryan said firmly. "This is what you were meant to do for you." Tears welled in her eyes. "But I don't have the money, the experience, I took care of it," he said, cutting her off gently. "The place is fully paid for. I know the right people to help you get started, but the rest? That's all you." Emily covered her mouth with her hand, her shoulders trembling. This was impossible. This wasn't her life. She was the woman who barely scraped by, who counted every penny, who had spent years accepting that dreams were just that, dreams. Her throat tightened, her voice barely a whisper. "Why would you do this?" Bryan smiled, his eyes warm. "Because I believe in you." Emily let out a breathless laugh, a sound that was more disbelief than joy. She turned in a slow circle, taking in every inch of the space that now belonged to her. A real kitchen, a real restaurant, a real chance. Just then she felt a small hand slip into hers. She looked down to find Sophia standing beside her, gazing up at her with excited eyes. The little girl had followed her inside, unnoticed, and now she was looking around in wonder. "Mama," she whispered, "we have a restaurant." Emily let out a shaky laugh, a fresh wave of tears escaping down her cheeks. Yes, they did. For the first time in as long as she could remember, Emily didn't feel like she was fighting a losing battle. She didn't feel like she was barely keeping her head above water. She felt like she was stepping into something new, something better. And all because one stranger had refused to walk away. In the days that followed, Lokia Deona transformed from an empty shell into something full of warmth, purpose, and life. What was once a silent, untouched space now buzzed with energy. The scent of fresh herbs and sizzling butter filled the air, mingling with the laughter of customers and the rhythmic sounds of kitchen life, the chop of a knife against a cutting board, the clatter of plates, the low murmur of conversation. Emily poured everything she had into her new restaurant. She arrived before dawn, unlocking the doors with a sense of pride that she had never felt before. The moment she stepped inside, she was no longer just Emily the worker, Emily the mother, Emily the woman struggling to get by. She was Emily the chef, Emily the business owner, Emily the dreamer. The early mornings were spent carefully kneading dough, simmering broths, and testing new recipes, ensuring that every dish carried a story, a memory, a piece of her. She moved through the kitchen with a newfound confidence, her hands steady as she plated meals that she had once only imagined serving. And it wasn't just about the food, it was about the feeling, the warmth, the welcome, the second chances. Customers trickled in slowly at first, curious about the little place on the corner with the cozy interior and the simple but heartfelt menu. And then, and as word spread, the trickle became a steady flow. People didn't just come for the food, they came for the story. They came for the woman who had built something out of nothing, the mother who had fought against the odds, the chef who had found her way back to her passion. Through it all, Sophia became her mother's biggest cheerleader. The little girl, who had once spent nights drawing pictures of homes they never had, now had a home within the walls of Lucia Deona. She proudly arranged menus, carefully straightening each one on the tables before customers arrived. She created colorful, hand-drawn signs that read things like, "Every dish is made with love. Smile, you're in Mama's restaurant." This place was built with kindness. And of course, her favorite, "This is my mom's restaurant." Whenever new customers walked in, Sophia would greet them with a bright smile, sometimes even guiding them to their seats. "You should try the soup," she would say. "My mom makes the best soup." Her excitement was infectious. Every time Emily glanced over and saw Sophia chatting happily with customers, saw her daughter looking proud, safe, and truly happy, she felt something deep in her chest, something that reminded her this was more than just a restaurant. This was home, the man who never took credit. And Bryan, he never stepped into the spotlight. He visited from time to time, always sitting in the same quiet corner, watching everything unfold with a knowing smile. He never introduced himself as the man behind the scenes, never asked for thanks, never sought recognition. He simply watched as Emily flourished, as Lucia Deona became a place of comfort and joy, as the woman who once doubted herself became someone who believed. One evening, long after the last customer had left, Emily finally sat down at one of the small tables. Her body ached from the long hours, but for once, it was the kind of exhaustion that felt fulfilling, not defeating. Bryan leaned casually against the counter, his usual calm expression in place. Emily exhaled, looking around the restaurant that was hers. The wooden chairs were slightly askew from earlier guests, the last few dishes sat soaking in the sink, and the faint aroma of spices still lingered in the air. She turned to Bryan, her voice soft. "You never told me why you did all of this for me." Bryan shrugged, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "Because I could." Emily shook her head, smiling despite herself. "No, it's more than that." He held her gaze for a moment, then sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Maybe I just saw someone who reminded me of what it's like to fight him for something. To hold on to a dream even when the world tells you it's impossible." Emily swallowed, a lump forming in her throat. For years, she had felt invisible, like no one saw her, like no one cared. But Bryan had seen her, and because of that, her entire world had changed. She blinked back tears, looking at him with quiet gratitude. "Well, you changed my life." Bryan's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "I just gave you a little push," he said. "You made the change." And with that, he stepped back, the way he always did, quietly, humbly, without expecting anything in return. Emily watched him go, knowing that even if she never saw him again, she would never forget him, because he was the person who had reminded her that kindness still existed. A restaurant that became a beacon of hope. From that day forward, Lucia Deona became more than just a restaurant. It became a sanctuary, a place where people came not just to eat, but to belong. The walls, once bare and silent, now held framed photos, pictures of Emily and Sophia, of the first dish Emily ever served, of the growing community that had embraced this small, once forgotten place. And tucked in a corner, one picture stood alone, a small note scribbled at the bottom. "Because I could." Emily never forgot where she started, and she never forgot who helped her get here. So whenever a struggling single mother walked through her doors, or a lost soul needed a second chance, she was there, offering them the same kindness that had once saved her. Because sometimes that one act of compassion is all it takes to change a life forever.